Hello everyone, welcome to the PowerPlayChess channel, and it's time to have a look at the 8th round of the Tata Steel Masters tournament in Wijk aan Zee. I would like to discuss with you the fantastic matchup between Fabiano Caruana with the white pieces against world champion Magnus Carlsen, and they have played countless times against each other, and everybody remembers their epic world championship match in 2018 in London. 12 draws in classical play, and only in the tiebreak Magnus managed to retain his world title. But they have played many classical games against each other in several tournaments, and also in Tata Steel tournament they play basically every year against each other. This year it's Fabiano with the white pieces, and it's an Ruy Lopez e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castle kingside, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, and castling kingside. This is a very well-known position, which I actually covered 1 month ago on the PowerPlayChess channel as well, because with castling kingside, black is inviting his opponent to enter the Marshall Gambit starting from the move c3 when black can play the move d5. I gave you a small update on the ins and outs of this Marshall Gambit. But nowadays it's very well known that with moves like h3, d3 or a4 we get a sort of anti-Marshall, and Fabiano goes for the move a4. It's a very well-known move, and black has several ways to meet the threat of a takes b5 when the rook on a8 is actually unprotected. And this was heavily discussed in Magnus his last World Championship match against Jan Nepomniachtchi. Because in the third game of that match, Magnus played the move bishop b7 against Jan Nepomniachtchi. And only to deviate in in game 5 and game 7 with the move rook b8. Both moves are possible. But the main move for black here is to push the pawn to b4, which has the advantage of depriving the knight from ever getting developed to c3. White has various ways of playing here. I like the ambitious approach by Fabiano, as he plays a5, trying to separate black's pawns from each other, and who knows, maybe the pawn on b4 may become potentially a target for one of white's pieces. Black plays d6, and here Fabiano has a big choice to make. In many cases it's very natural to play here the move to play the move d3 to be able to get the bishop out at some point, but also to be able to develop the knight to d2 and maybe later to c4. But Fabiano has a more ambitious idea in mind, as he goes for the move c3. He's not planning to play the move d3 anytime soon, but he would like to occupy the center anyway with the move d4 very soon. But Magnus played rook b8, very important idea. So the rook is ready to become active along the b file, potentially targeting the bishop on b3, which is still being defended by the queen, but definitely black is happy to put a rook over there. And interesting moment, because here Fabiano deviates from a couple of games he played before in this position with the move bishop c4. And I think this move makes a lot of sense. Bishop is slightly better placed than it is on b3, where it is quite vulnerable, and it keeps an eye on the pawn on a6. But of course there are a lot of theoretical subtleties which we are not entirely familiar with. But these guys, they know of course what they do. I think Fabiano played 5 classical games with his move bishop c4. But now he deviates with the move h3. Was played in the game. It's a kind of a useful move, because white is always planning to play d4, and after taking on d4, ed4, cd4, white doesn't want to get bothered with bishop g4 ideas. That's why the move h3 is so often so useful in the Ruy Lopez. And black makes a similar waiting move. He plays the move h6, and this move is actually not designed against a potential pin of the bishop coming to g5, but more that black would like to place its rook on e8 anytime soon, because white is planning to play d4, which was actually played in the game. But later on, we put our rook on e8 with the idea to exert pressure against the pawn on e4. And thanks to the move h6, we no longer have to watch out for knight g5 ideas attacking the pawn on f7. Magnus was actually not aware of this position, he admitted afterwards. And he was on his own, but he played very naturally. He decided to take on c3. And now white recaptures with a pawn, because we are intending to recapture on d4 with a pawn, at least retain control over there. Because if you do take with a knight, the problem is that we can take with a knight on d4, and after knight takes d4, e takes d4, you cannot take with the queen on d4, because that leaves the bishop on b3 unprotected. And that means black is winning a pawn in this particular line. So white has to recapture with a pawn. And now after e takes d4, interesting moment, because here the new idea is revealed. White decided to recapture with a knight on d4. And that's a very remarkable idea. It's a move I would not have predicted. I think c takes d4 is much more natural to keep the nice flexible pawn structure intact. But in that case, black can counter with d5 and try to gain some influence in the center. Of course, if white would ever decide to take on d5, you're able to recapture with a knight, and black is very comfortable here. Nice active squares for its minor pieces. While after advancing the pawn to e5, we have a very nice outpost on e4. And it looks as if white has a nice space advantage in the center, thanks to the pawns on d4 and e5. But black has plenty of counterplay. Knight on e4 is well placed. And one of the ideas will be to put our knight on b4, following it up with the move c5. And that promises black quite some active play. Fabiano didn't take with the pawn, as I said, decided to recapture with the knight, but of course that also gives black more control over some central squares, particularly the e5 square. And that's what Magnus had in mind here. He first of all, he puts the bishop on d7. He's not interested in taking on d4, which allows white to get some control in the center again, improves the pawn structure, but he puts the bishop on d7 and protects the knight. Very simple. So Fabiano played here the move bishop to f4. And this is actually the official novelty. There was one game of Nguyen against Wojtaszek in Poland 2022. And in that game there followed knight d2 instead. But bishop f4 is a somewhat more active move, trying to get the bishop out first before placing the knight on d2. But here Magnus replies in a very strong way. He decides to put its knight on e5, which is, of course would not have been possible had white recaptured with the pawn on d4, as that would control the e5 square. And now we see some small problems for white already popping up, because the natural developing move knight b to d2 cannot be recommended here because of knight d3 forking the rook and the bishop, so that will win the exchange at least. So if that's not possible, white still has some issues completing its development on the queen side. And Fabiano felt that he needed to develop its knight in a different way. Played here knight a3, but as we will get to see in the game, that knight is actually not so well placed on the edge of the board. Instead, white probably was supposed to play here the move bishop to g3 instead. And the main point is to prepare developing its knight to d2 without getting bothered by knight d3 ideas attacking the bishop on f4. But anyway, let's see what happened in the game. Fabiano played here knight a3, and now Magnus continues improving its position with very simple moves. Nothing special yet. He puts the rook on e8. And the idea is that the rook will soon attack the pawn on e4 after the bishop drops back to f8. White could still have tried to defend against that potential idea, by taking on e5, which is not what Fabiano did. Fabiano played here bishop g3. But let's say if you take on e5, there is d takes e5. We have a symmetrical pawn structure. Looks as if there cannot be too much wrong with white's position, but just one simple line. Let's say the knight drops back to f3. Now, very remarkable move. There's bishop takes a3. Black gives up the pair of bishops with the idea that after rook takes a3, there is queen to e7, attacking the rook on a3. The rook will drop back, and next move the queen will come to c5. And I believe that black is having a very nice edge here, because these two pawns, they are definitely more vulnerable than black's pawns on the queen side. And the rook on b8 is very active. The other rook could come to d8 as well. So that's the reason why Fabiano didn't want to trade on e5 with the bishop. Instead, as I said, he played here bishop to g3. And this is going to be a very aggressive plan, which actually Magnus was hoping to get to see on the board. He continues with its plan to drop back with the bishop to f8. And here Fabiano has still plenty of reasonable options. Probably a solid move like bishop c2 would have been the way to go, so that the bishop will never be vulnerable on the b file. The bishop protects the pawn on e4 one more time. But instead Fabiano plays very aggressive here with the move f4, trying to kick the knight out of the center. And the knight has only 2 squares to go to. It could go to g6, but the knight is not doing that much over there. And Magnus instead decided to come back to c6. And that looks weird, because the knight was a couple of moves ago. It was still on that square. But there are some issues with the pawn on e4. Black is actually threatening to take. But also the pawn on a5 is definitely vulnerable. And white needs to reckon with that pawn weakness. But play becomes very concrete. The reason why Fabiano went for this line with f4 is that he wanted to play here e5. Very aggressive move, targeting the knight one more time, and the knight doesn't have a good square to go to. First of all, black can just take on e5, which was played by the world champ. F takes e5, and of course the pawn on e5 is well defended by both the rook and bishop. Twice defended, twice attacked. Makes no sense to take on e5. But how to react? This is the critical moment of the game, which Magnus had evaluated way better than its opponent. And very important is that you try to keep fighting for the initiative. And Magnus did that with the move knight takes d4. Before we go there, I would like to mention that a soft move like knight h7, first of all, the knight is badly placed at the side of the board. But it also gives white the opportunity to blow up the center here with the move e6. After fe6, you take with a knight, threatening to take the queen. The diagonal for the bishop has been opened. After bishop takes e6, bishop takes e6, king comes to h8. Queens can be exchanged, rook takes d8, and now white finally has a lot of active pieces here. Bishop pair in an open position. This is definitely better for white. Probably Fabiano had been hoping on this line, but there followed very strong move. Knight takes d4. Let's have a look what is happening here. Of course, c takes d4 is the natural recapture, which was played by white. Should be mentioned that the other captures there are not recommendable, because in case you do take with the queen, then the bishop is unprotected. Requires a bit of calculation. There's rook takes b3. White can take still the knight on f6. But at the end of the day, the knight on a3 is still hanging. So that means that black just wins material. Is a piece up. And after, instead of queen takes d4, if you do take on f6 straight away, then you can simply take with the knight on b3. And also in that case, black is just a full piece up. So after knight takes d4, c takes d4 is the only move. Critical moment, because black still has this issue with the knight on f6. It could go back to h7, but that's not really what you want to do. But Magnus found a fantastic tactical resource here with the move bishop to c6, guys. This is a fantastic move. Very difficult to see from afar. Probably this was misjudged by by Fabiano. Let's have a look, because at this point Fabiano collapsed. But let's try to study the position first before we move on to the game. We need to understand why white cannot actually take on f6, the knight. There will follow rook takes e1. And now choice, how to recapture. If you do take with the queen, you can take on b3. So the queen is no longer defending the bishop on b3. Now the knight is hanging. And if you move the knight away, we can simply take with the queen on f6. And this is a terrible position. You're pawn up as black, bishop pair, active pieces, and you have a devastating kingside attack, because white doesn't get a chance to take on c7. It will run into bishop takes g2, for instance, with the point that if you do recapture, there's queen c6 with a powerful check, double, triple attack even. The king is open. This will be game over in just a few moves. So after rook takes e1, white cannot recapture with the queen. If you do recapture backwards with the bishop, bishop takes e1, there is this huge move, rook takes b3. And that deflects the queen from protecting the pawn on d4. After queen takes b3, there's queen takes d4 with a check, king h2, and now we can safely take on a1. Here again, black is material up, but everything is actually hanging. Knight on a3, bishop on e1, bishop d6 is on the agenda as well. This is totally game over. So thanks to this move bishop c6, we have some tactical ideas. But also after any random move by white, if white doesn't capture on f6, at least we do have control over both the d5 and e4 squares. So that means that the knight doesn't have to come back to h7, but can just stand on an active square in the center. White should probably have played here a move like rook f1, hoping to set up some counterplay against the pawn on f7, but knight d5 is one possibility, but even stronger is trying to neutralize the pressure against that pawn on f7, offering the exchange of light squared bishops. If you do take on d5, knight takes d5, the knight is very solidly placed in the center, can no longer be kicked away by any of white's pawns. And, black has still quite good chances to exert pressure against the pawn on d4. Knight on a3 is still badly placed. Black is a bit better. And if white would decide to keep the bishops on the board, there's knight e4. And also here we have a quite nice configuration of minor pieces in the center. Black is very comfortable targeting the bishop on g3 in the meantime as well. But here, let's have a look. Critical moment. Fabiano made a huge blunder. He couldn't handle the crisis in the center. Dropped back with the bishop to c2. Very understandable, of course, because in many lines we see the bishop is a vulnerable piece. Probably he was hoping that he could set up a battery with queen and bishop on the b1 h7 diagonal. But he overlooked black's next move, queen to d5. Massive threat of mate on g2. For that reason, the knight on f6 cannot be taken. Fabiano played rook e2, covering the mating threat on g2. And another big moment, because we are fighting for the initiative. We have to watch out for our knight on f6. Of course, knight d7 is not a move you want to play. There would follow bishop e4, and black is in trouble all of a sudden. But instead, fighting for the initiative, black finds the weak spot in white's position and played here the move rook to b4. Fantastic. There is this threat of taking on d4, and it's very difficult to defend the pawn. First of all, if you do take the knight on f6, there is rook takes e2. Queen takes e2, the mating threat is still covered, but once again we have queen takes d4 with a double attack, attacking the king and the rook. King h2, queen takes a1, it's totally game over. You cannot take on f6, but how to defend the pawn on d4, that's the next question. If you play bishop f2, ouch, the pawn is no longer defended, it's just made in one. And if you do play rook d2, which is the move you would want to play, but then we see the rook is overloaded. It's defending both the d4 and the g2 pawn. There is rook takes d4, crushing the center. Rook takes d4 is not possible because of mate, and black is also threatening to take on d2, winning the rook. So once again, there's no time to take on f6. It's all game over. In the game, white played here king h2, desperate move, but it's totally game over now. There is rook takes d4. The queen went to b1. There's not any sort of convenient square for the queen to go to. And also the knight is safe. Magnus has plenty of ways to convert his advantage, but decided to play it safe here with the move knight e4. It's a good move, typical Magnus move. He is ready to go into a winning endgame. He feels comfortable converting these advantages. We will get to see in a second how he managed to do that. Probably even more powerful would have been the move rook d2, trying to deliver checkmate on g2. After rook takes d2, queen takes d2. There is a mating threat, as I said. Queen f1, and now the knight can even come to h5, intending to take on g3. The bishop is an important defender of the pawn on e5, so next move, the pawn on e5 will fall as well. Totally game over. This is one beautiful line. After rook d2, perhaps Magnus didn't like rook d2 because of bishop b3, trying to deflect the queen from its defensive duty of covering the rook. But there's one wonderful line I couldn't resist sharing with you. Queen takes g2, rook takes g2, rook takes g2. And now we have this windmill motif with the rook and bishop on this diagonal against the king in the corner. First we capture the bishop on g3 with check. And after king comes to h2, we give a check on g2, king h1, and now rook b2 is probably the simplest one. This is just game over. Anyway, Magnus didn't play this. He played knight to e4, and also in a couple of moves it was time to resign. Bishop takes, rook takes, rook takes, queen takes, queen takes, bishop takes. Black is a pawn up with a bishop pair. Pawn on e5 is quite vulnerable. In case of a move like e6, trying to trade off the e pawn for the pawn on c7, well, the rook will eventually enter via the c file. First, we are going to attack the knight on a3 after the bishop goes away, of course. And once the knight moves, we put our rook on c2 with devastating threats against the pawn on g2. For that reason, knight c4 was played first. Rook b8. And now white's position collapsed very fast now. There followed rook c1, trying to consolidate the position with the knight. But rook b5 is a very efficient move, keeping an eye on the pawn on a5, so the knight cannot really easily move. White played here e6, and now after fe6, bishop takes c7. There is rook c5 with a very unpleasant pin attacking the bishop. The bishop went back to f4, but now after bishop d5. Fabiano had seen enough. He is unable to create any serious drawing chances. He is a pawn down. He got to move the knight. Let's say the knight goes to e5. But then you can take on c1, bishop takes c1, and bishop to b4, winning a second pawn. Bishop and two pawns, the bishop pair and two pawns is simply too much. So after bishop d5, white resigned. Very painful loss in only 33 moves, but fantastic positional understanding and calculation by the world champion. So with his victory, he is back on +1. He has 4.5 out of 8. And since the leader, Nodiberg Abdusattorov, only drew his game against Aronian and also Anish Giri with the white pieces made a draw with Vincent Keimer. Also Wesley So with the white pieces couldn't win against Ding Liren. Magnus is only 1.5 point behind the leader Nodiberg Abdusattorov. Let's see if he is still able to pull off a miracle with an amazing comeback. Would be fantastic for the tournament. We are going into the rest day now on Monday, and on Tuesday Danny will be back with the action here on the channel. Hope to see you then as well. Take care, all the best, bye bye.